Welcome to the ultimate crowdsourced personal finance show. This is your Friday Roundup.
You're listening to Choose FI Radio. The blueprint for financial independence lives here. If you're looking to unlock the secrets to financial independence and early retirement, you're in the right place. Stay tuned and join a community of like-minded people who are getting off the hamster wheel and taking control of their lives in the pursuit of financial independence. Choose FI, your home for financial independence online.
All right, everyone, super excited about this Drawdown case study. We did not announce this to you on Monday because, to be honest with you, we didn't know if we'd be able to turn it around fast enough. But one of our most requested guests is Big ERN from Early Retirement Now. And I think the reason for that is well justified in that Big ERN has probably written one of the most thorough, I would say the ultimate guide. I try not to use that too lightly, but the ultimate guide to sequence of return and drawdown strategy. Really looking at it from probably the most comprehensive angle imaginable. I think our thought was, as we're starting to increasingly get case studies of people that are approaching drawdown, to be able to apply his framework to it to basically say, does this work with different variables? So yeah, to help me with this, I have my co-host Brad here with me today. How you doing, buddy?
Hey, Jonathan, I'm doing quite well. Agreed. This episode 152 with Becky Heptig, and she talked about her financial life with her and her husband, Steven. What's interesting is they are at this point where drawdowns are realistic for them. Becky talked about this in the podcast on Monday. When it comes time to actually take that money out, withdrawing money being like stabbing herself in the heart. Jonathan, stabbing herself in the heart. But I think a lot of that just comes from a lack of being comfortable with it. And I think what's beautiful about what Big ERN, who's also known as Karsten, does is provide this level of understanding. Karsten, I'm so curious and so interested and excited for you to help us walk through this amazing case study of Becky and Steven.
Thanks for having me on.
So let's talk about some practicalities here in that, and this is one of the brilliant pieces that you made when you were starting to write the Safe Withdrawal Rate series, was that accumulation is relatively easy. There may be some nuances. Some people may have some different ways that they approach it, but really simplicity is your best friend when it comes to accruing wealth. The counterpoint being drawdown is not. Drawdown is very nuanced, and there's a lot of factors that you need to think about when coming up with a realistic drawdown strategy.
Yeah, that's right. When you accumulate assets, we have all of these rules of thumbs like automate your savings and don't think too hard about stock market volatility. And I can tell you that once you're in the phase where you withdraw money from your portfolio, you definitely are a lot more worried about stock market volatility. And you are a lot more worried about digging into your principal. And it's a lot of retirees have this fear of touching their principal. And part of it is justified, but there's also part of it that's unjustified, right? Because unless you have a constraint that you have to maintain your capital because you want to leave a big bequest, it's okay to draw down your capital at a measured pace and slowly. And so don't deprive yourself, right? Don't have the scarcity mindset. And you should do your withdrawals confidently because that's what your retirement should be about, right? It should be fun. It should be confident. It should be comfortable. Don't have the scarcity mindset where you live like misers in retirement because you're afraid to touch your principal.
So let's talk about, I think, one of the big things that when you're talking about drawdown, you have to consider, and that is sequence of return risk. And this is an idea that really was introduced to me by you. And it's one that I think for our audience is important to keep in mind. And at the heart of it is that at the point of retirement, the first 5 years really matter.
Right. Again, that's a rule of thumb. It could also be longer, right? Because there are some instances where so the people that retired in the mid 60s to late 60s, they had very poor returns until basically 1982, and that's when the recovery started again. So 5 years is probably a good estimate, but there were some instances where the drawdown period was even a lot longer. And what sank you in the mid-60s was not just the first 5 years, it's actually the first 15 to 17 or 18 years, actually.
And that's one of the things that makes this interesting is when you're a mathematician or a statistician and you're trying to figure out, well, what number would work? Well, then you're confronted with all these time variables. So what worked on this decade period would not have worked over here. And what worked over, back in for the last decade may not work for this decade. So you're trying to have one number, one drawdown number to rule them all. In reality, that doesn't really reflect life because there are other variables at place, which is why I think taking kind of the framework and the variables that are these big multipliers, the ones that cause the biggest change in the outcome, taking that and applying it to an actual case study is very valuable for the community.
Right. Very good.
So let's take a look at Becky. If we just this past week talked to Becky and her husband and basically started out with virtually no net worth at the age of 50, and then through incredible savings and intensity over the following subsequent 13 plus years, they reached a point where they're ready to retire. And now this, in fact, is the first year that they are actually going to be drawing down. Brad's analogy of feeling like you're stabbing yourself in your heart. We connected you with Becky just to basically take a look at her numbers. You're doing a post that's live the same day as this where people can actually follow through it. And I hope they will actually go check that out. But I'm curious, as you talked with Becky to find out where she was at, what were the questions that you were asking and what's your assessment?
Well, you basically want to take stock of what do you have, what are your assets and liabilities, what are your spending constraints, and then what you will notice when you look at some real world examples, right? Not the academic exercises, not the numerical examples like the Trinity study or the 4% rule calculations. The life is a lot more complicated than that, right? So a lot of times your retirement is basically a multi-phase withdrawal strategy, right? And there are multiple phases. So right now they're in the early 60s. They plan to take Social Security as late as possible. So they're going to wait until Steven is 70 and Becky is 69 in order to maximize the Social Security benefits. So they have a very large cash flow demand right now, but then once Social Security kicks in, then they can reduce their withdrawals and then rely mostly on Social Security. So, and Becky and Steven have this advantage that a lot of us in the early retirement community, for example, don't have, right? So for us, Social Security is almost like an afterthought, right? We have to fund pretty much all of our retirement from our savings. And then, towards the end, we get a little bit of supplemental income from Social Security. For them, it's almost the other way around. They have to bridge their cash flow needs for roughly the first 6 years until Social Security kicks in. And then they have much lower withdrawals until basically the end of their life. Well, so there was another constraint that, what happens if late in life you have a health episode and you have to move into an assisted living facility or a nursing home? That would be the final phase of the withdrawal strategy. So that means that the withdrawals are not flat over time. So you can't just say, I have a 30 or 35 or 40-year retirement horizon. I look at what is my safe withdrawal rate. I look it up in some table, in some academic paper or in the Trinity study. So that's just not going to work in the real world. You have to look at your actual real numbers. What are your assets? What are your liabilities? What are the cash flows over time? There's also a bit of a tax planning element in this. So, for example, Becky and her husband want to do the Roth conversions over time during the first few years before Social Security kicks in. There are just so many different bells and whistles that this is not really something that you can just study from the Trinity study, right? This is something that you have to do on a case-by-case basis.
All right, Karsten, so let's slow down a little bit here. We're going to actually run through their case study. This is a dual phase retirement in essence that I guess Becky right now is 63, Steven's 64. They have to get to when Steven is 70, and it sounds like they're going to get a significant amount of Social Security. And I'd love for you to talk us through first what you expect them to get through Social Security and what that looks like 70 and beyond. And then let's kind of bridge into that first 6 or 7 year period.
Right. So in about 6 years, Steven is going to get $3,500 per month in Social Security. So that's close to the absolute maximum you can get. So the good news is, he has had 35 years of very high earnings. at the maximum or close to the Social Security maximum that gets taxed every year. And then Becky had slightly lower income. So she would actually do best if she takes the spousal benefit. That's a huge benefit, by the way, for married couples, that if one spouse has lower Social Security income, you can opt to take either your own income or half of your spouse's income, Social Security benefit. So she would get around $1,600 because her husband would have gotten around $3,200 if he had retired at age 69, so 6 years from now. So she gets $1,600, the husband gets $3,500, so that's $5,100 or $61,000 per year once Social Security kicks in. And their budget is around $80,000 a year. And actually, after I went back and forth with her a few times, she asked me, well, can we raise it to about $90,000 a year? So if your budget is $80,000 a year, it means that you have to fund only the gap between your $61,000 in Social Security income and your $80,000 budget once Social Security kicks in. So there's this two-phase problem where in the beginning you have very high withdrawals, and then luckily they'll be much lower once your benefits kick in.
Now, this is very interesting because we kind of started off by talking about sequence of return risk, and the first 5 years really matter. Like the first 5 years is when they really need the money the most. And, they're starting out with a just over $1 million portfolio, and they've got this budget that at the age of 70, so roughly in about 6 years, the vast majority, well over 50% of their needs are going to be covered by this Social Security that they've delayed on. But in the intervening 5 years, they need this money now. So I know they said that they were really inspired by Fritz from Retirement Manifesto and his bucket strategy, and we're using a piece of that. I'm just curious, as you take this kind of dual phase strategy that you're talking about, and you think about it in terms of one, a glide path, and two, in terms of some sort of bucket strategy system where, the volatility, we're at or near the top of the market and we don't know what's coming next year. Like, how does someone with that kind of mentality, what's the plan for making this as smooth of an experience as possible? Going into retirement with confidence.
Right. So my recommendation to them is that they should not be afraid of drawing down their portfolio slightly over the first 6 years, right? Because even if they draw down their portfolio, as right now, I think it's about $1.35 million, and they draw it down by half over the first 6 years, or maybe even all the way down to $500,000, that would still look like a viable plan, because once Social Security kicks in and you need only, say, $20,000 in withdrawals and you have a $500,000 portfolio, you can actually still make it, especially say we're going to have a bad recession and a bad bear market over the next 6 years, and you end up with only, quote unquote, $500,000 once Social Security kicks in. At that point, you start withdrawing $20,000 from a $500,000 portfolio. That would be a 4% withdrawal rate, but it would be a 4% withdrawal rate at the bottom of the recession, at the bottom of the bear market. So even at $500,000, that still looks like it's a viable portfolio. So we want to get away from this mindset that we can't dig into the principal, right? That's why you built your portfolio to $1.3 million, to spend the money at some point. So it's actually, you can afford to withdraw something like $80,000, plus you have to pay a little bit of taxes because you want to do the Roth conversions along the way. So that creates a bit of taxable income. So let's round that up. Let's assume that your withdrawals are $90,000 a year. So now you're withdrawing somewhere close to 6.7% every year. And we're so far into the bull market at another all-time high right now. So it sounds really scary to withdraw almost 7% from your portfolio. But again, it's only for a very short period of time. And even if you draw down your portfolio, you will still make it in the end, because then Social Security kicks in and then you're almost home free.
Karsten, I have a question about the taxation, actually. So assuming that they plan to live on around $80,000, and let's even put the Roth conversions aside for a second.
Right.
Do we have a sense of what their federal and state tax liability is? I guess put another way, is the $80,000 that they plan to live on, is some component of that taxation, or do we have to gross up for what their actual withdrawal is?
So we should gross that up. So we should consider, in order for me to get $80,000 net consumption every year, I would have to withdraw a little bit more because I have to pay taxes for that. And so they will obviously max out their standard deduction, which is somewhere around $24,800. And I think it goes up once the spouses go above age 65. You add another $1,350 a year. So you could assume that your standard deduction is almost $30,000. So that is completely tax-free. And then after that, the nice thing is everything you make above that, ordinary income is initially taxed at 10% federal, and then you get into the second tax bracket at 12% federal. Colorado, I think, is a 4.63% flat tax rate, but there's some exemption also for retirement income, and they have to confirm that with their tax accountant. But I don't think that Colorado taxes Social Security benefits. So that's good news once Social Security kicks in. Yeah, so you will probably have to pay initially for the first 6 years while you do the Roth conversions. You're going to have to budget probably $9,000-$10,000 a year to pay for taxes because you try to max out your Roth conversions every year in order to roll off that relatively large pile that they have in a traditional IRA. Now, the good news for Becky and Steven is that they actually do have the majority of their assets are already in a taxable account, and then they have a little bit of a Roth and a health savings account, and then they can basically use that health savings account as a quasi-Roth IRA. And I think they have around a little bit under $500,000 in a 401k. That's less than 50% of their portfolio. Oftentimes, with retirees, you see that they have the overwhelming majority of their assets in a 401k, and then they will get into required minimum distributions later. So the case of Becky and Steven was actually one of the quote unquote easier cases where it's relatively straightforward to roll that pile of money in the 401k / traditional IRA over to a Roth, and they will never get into this issue that they'll have the required minimum distributions. Of course, it's a good problem to have, right? If you have such a humongous 401k and required minimum distributions kick in, it's a good problem to have. But again, I'd still avoid having to pay ordinary income taxes on all of that later when the portfolio has grown. So it's best to move it over to a Roth. So I did some calculations in a simple spreadsheet where I found it's actually easy to completely convert the entire portfolio into a Roth. So all of the retirement accounts, they will be in either a Roth or the health savings accounts or quasi-Roth. And then they would have lived off of the taxable accounts in the beginning. So eventually they will have essentially 100% Roth IRA, and then they will live completely tax-free in the future, except for Social Security, which will be taxed on your federal return, but it's only 85% of your benefits from Social Security will be taxed on your federal return. So you will still have a few $1,000s in tax liability on your federal return pretty much for the entire duration of your retirement, even once you complete the Roth conversions, and that's due to the Social Security benefits. But keep in mind, so the first almost $30,000 will be tax-free, and then the first, I think, $17,000 or $18,000 is taxed at only 10%. So the tax liabilities later in retirement, they can probably keep a lid on them, and they will be very minor. But yeah, you are absolutely right. When you do your safe withdrawal analysis, you also want to factor in your taxes. Absolutely.
So from the sound of this, they have a significant amount of their net worth. You said well more than half in taxable accounts. So for this 6-year period where they need to draw down approximately $80,000 per year, let's not even talk about inflation, but let's just say $80,000 per year, that can come out of their taxable accounts, which to everybody out there, that's just a fancy way of saying their savings, basically. This is money that's already been taxed. There's no taxable event as in when you're pulling out of a 401k and it's ordinary income. There might be capital gains on selling shares and such. So the taxation will be very minimal, basically, to get them to this point where they're getting Social Security 6 years from now. It sounds like the significant portion of the heavy lifting is really done for them. Now, I'm curious, when you did your analysis with the Roth IRA conversion, they can access that money penalty-free 5 years from when they actually undertake the conversion. Is that accurate?
I think I have to double check with your accountant, but I think that 5-year limit is for us early retirees, because they are already past age 59 and a half. If they roll a traditional IRA into a Roth, it should be accessible right away. So,
that's
so I think
very-
that 5-year window and the ladder, that is something for the early retirees. That would be a constraint for early retirees, probably not for Becky and Steven. Even then, because they have actually so much money in the taxable account that they can live off of. By the time they really have to access the Roth IRAs, that's going to be so deep into retirement that I think they probably don't have to access their Roth IRAs until they're about 70 or so really late into their retirement because of Social Security.
Gotcha. So when you're figuring out the amounts for them to convert through this Roth IRA conversion, are you basing it on their 80,000, or are you only basing it on they're really only going to need 20,000 a year? Like, are you massaging the tax rates in essence?
So they have 6 years to convert their traditional IRA. So the traditional IRA is right now about $490,000. And then how long it takes to convert that. So, I mean, first of all, every year, what you want to do is you want to look at your tax brackets, right? And you want to see how much of your taxable income have you already used up, because there's this jump from a 12% marginal tax rate to a 22% marginal tax rate. So you don't want to convert so much of your traditional IRA in any one given year that it puts you into the 22% tax bracket. The analysis that I did was that later in retirement, they will be pretty squarely in the 12% tax bracket, federal. Of course, this is always subject to the constraints. Well, tax laws could change, right? But will the 2018 tax reform, will that stay in the long term? There's actually some of the tax cuts are going to expire in, I think, 2025 or 2026. But they'll always come up with some kind of last minute compromise to make them permanent. That's my working assumption. But anyways, what I was trying to get to here is that in their particular case, it would seem optimal to do the Roth conversions so as to maximize their first two tax brackets on the federal return. So look at what is your ordinary income plus all of the other income, right? They have some income from interest and dividends that will all go onto your federal tax return. And if you add up your standard deduction, which is somewhere around $25,000, plus the first two tax brackets, which is, I think somewhere it's a little bit over $75,000. So you can generate around $100,000 in total income, and that will still keep you in the 12% bracket. So, and then you basically look at probably every year in December, how much money have you earned so far? And again, your brokerage account should give you the data. How much interest income have you generated so far? How much dividend income have you generated? How much capital gains? And then you just look at what is the top of my 12% bracket. You subtract your income year to date, and that's what you're going to convert. And that could be as high as $80,000 a year, or maybe a little bit more. It could be a little bit less, depending on how their taxable income is that year. So you can definitely make a really nice dent in your traditional IRAs. And now I can't guarantee that they will convert all of the traditional IRAs by the time Social Security kicks in. Because remember, by the time Social Security kicks in, now you have this huge, well, relatively huge taxable income on your federal return, which is $61,000 Social Security. Well, 85% of that, but that's still somewhere around $50,000. So now your space in your tax return brackets is a lot less for the Roth conversions. But cross your fingers, by that time you should have already converted either everything or the overwhelming majority. And then you can really decide, what do you want to do now? Do you want to keep doing the Roth conversions? If you still have enough money in your taxable account to fund your expenses, right? Remember, your withdrawals are now going to be much less because Social Security has kicked in. If you still have enough money in your taxable account, sure, use that to fund your expenses and then continue with your Roth conversions if you still have money in the traditional IRA, even once Social Security has kicked in. But it will be very limited. It might be only $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, no longer the $80,000 a year.
Right. So for me, just to recap, and I feel like I got most of that and it was really useful. So if you have close to $500,000, like in this particular case study, we have close to $500,000 in pre-tax buckets, and we're just now retired. So basically, we're controlling what our income is truly. We're controlling it because we can either draw down or not draw down. We have room to roll over upwards of $80,000 a year from these pre-tax buckets into this Roth. And what we're doing when we're picking that number, how much we're rolling over, we're looking at the tax brackets and we're saying, we really don't want to be paying more than 12% in federal tax. So we will roll over as much as we can up to the upper ends of that 12% marginal tax bracket. And then when we start to roll into 22% marginal tax bracket, or 22 or 25, that's getting a little too pricey for our taste, and we'll just scale it back down and we'll stay in that range. We can do that for as long as we can control our income, which is up until we start claiming Social Security at the age of 70. Once we start claiming Social Security, now suddenly we're going to have $60,000 in income that's going to be showing up on our federal tax bracket. So now we lose the ability to crush it with those Roth conversions. But it's really nice if you can lock in a 12% marginal tax bracket because you chose that.
Right.
You chose that's the tax bracket I want to be at.
Right. And then one other thing, if you go over by $300 and,
you fail.
And they go into the 22% bracket, don't beat yourself up, right? Because it's truly a marginal tax rate. So the 22% is truly only on the amount that you're above that limit. Everything else is still at the 12% bracket. I mean, some people might say, hey, I would like to go a little bit over just to make sure that I don't leave any money on the table in the 12% bracket. So it's your personal preference how you want to make sure that you either make sure that you don't get into the 22% bracket, or you make sure that you for sure max out that 12% bracket.
Yeah, Karsten, you stole my thunder. That was precisely what I was going to say. And we can't reiterate this enough. I think so many people get confused with how our taxation system works. And they're worried, oh, if I'm in the next tax bracket, it's as if all of my prior dollars are now taxed at that higher rate. So as you so eloquently said, if you're $300 over, that means those $300 are taxed at 22% in this arbitrary case instead of 12%. So we're talking literally $30 difference, that you additional tax. So don't beat yourself up. Clearly, you want to get as many dollars in those 10 and 12% without going into 22, but you don't have to be spot on to the dollar. So I just wanted to ask one real quick question, since we did kind of gloss over this a little bit, but it's essential, and I just don't know enough about it. These spousal benefits for Social Security. And now, obviously, I do not want to get into the political viability of Social Security. That's not what I'm getting at here at all. But just talk me through the viability of how this spousal benefit works, assuming you have to assume one of them is going to predecease the other at some point, right? So we're talking about getting this roughly $5,100 a month, but what happens if and when, certainly, one of them does predecease the other?
So if Steven is the survivor, then it's very simple. So he just keeps his benefits, and Becky will lose her benefits because she passed away. Now, if it's the other way around, so Becky is making only $1,600 and Steven $3,500. If Steven passes away, then Becky has the option, of course, in her case, it is a no-brainer. She has the option to take over Steven's benefits. That's called the survivor benefit. That's a huge benefit to married couples. And it's especially useful for couples where you have one very high earner and one very low earner, because that means that basically Steven can bequest his high Social Security benefits to his wife. There's a huge benefit that Becky can take over Steven's benefits. So it's as if she had earned all of these Social Security benefits. And so especially when you have a situation with two spouses where the one spouse is a lot younger and the younger spouse has a lower income, so you can extend the lifetime of the benefits of the high earner, because the low earner and the younger person will take over these high benefits. So there's a huge benefit. So this is actually one of the reasons why you probably, as a married couple, when you're in that situation where one spouse is younger and has a longer life expectancy and is also a lower earner, the higher earner definitely wants to wait as long as possible to claim benefits, because you can bequest the Social Security earnings to your younger spouse.
That's fantastic. Yeah, thanks for breaking this down for us. And then I'm curious if we actually think about the people that are listening to this show, and in particular leaning into this because they foresee a near future in which this reflects that they have some significant amount of net worth, Social Security is a reality. They're thinking about it dual phase, and they're preparing for their first year of drawdown. I'd like to spend just some time talking, Becky, again, going to this, I feel like I'm stabbing myself in the heart with this first, and I appreciate the fact that drawing down on principle is not the end of the world, but I just literally mean from a glide path perspective, from a bucket strategy perspective, from a, buffering yourself against volatility perspective. What are the guardrails that you would put in place for this scenario in terms of mechanically from a, hey, I need to have this checking account, I draw out all of next year, et cetera. What sort of framework would you think through with Becky and her scenario?
I'm actually a little bit cautious on these bucket strategies. Of course, I mean, you have to have a checking account. You probably have a money market account where you have a little bit of a cash reserve. So my personal preference would be that in retirement, you do the exact same thing as what you did saving for retirement. You automate your savings. Right? You do regular contributions to your 401k and regular savings into your other taxable accounts. You do the whole pay yourself first approach. And I think the same approach also works very well on the way out when you withdraw money. So you automate it. Doing all of this bucket strategy and cash bucket sounds a little bit like market timing. And market timing, I used to be a market timer in my real job, so I should be sympathetic to that. But I think it sounds like work. And very often when individual investors like us with all of our behavioral biases start doing that, it's a bit of a recipe for disaster. So I just want to give you one example. So imagine you are sitting on this cash bucket and you are withdrawing money from the cash bucket and you see your stocks go down in value. And you say, okay, well, great. I have this cash bucket and I can tap the cash bucket first and I can sit out until the market recovers. Well, unfortunately, the market sometimes takes much longer to recover, right? The bear market may only be 1 year or 1.5 or 2 years, but for the bear market to fully recover, right? Not only end the bear market, but go up again and reach the old all-time high and reach, say, the old all-time high plus inflation adjustment. That can be an affair of not 1 to 2 years, but that can be 5, 7 years, 10 years or longer. I've seen some examples where it took, I think, 13 or 15 years to recover again to the old all-time high. So this whole cash bucket business sounds a little bit like market timing, where I say, well, I have this cash bucket and I don't have to touch my stocks when stocks are going down. So you could even have a very counterproductive example where if you had withdrawn money from your stock portfolio right from the beginning, at least you would have still withdrawn money when stocks were high. But when stocks keep going down and down and down and down, and you first withdraw from your cash bucket, and then towards the end, that's when everything you withdraw comes out of your stock bucket, and that's right around the trough of the bear market. It may actually be counterproductive to have that cash bucket, because remember, at some point you have to replenish that cash bucket again. And if you replenish the cash bucket when stocks are down and potentially all the way at the bottom of the bear market, then you might have actually hurt yourself. So that's why I actually prefer to probably set up some kind of an automated withdrawal plan. Just like the money that goes in, you can automate that. Set up your withdrawals also in an automated plan, certainly for your base expenditures, right? For your base budget, for your property taxes and insurance and your credit card bills. And then maybe for major expenses, again, you can't really automate that. But again, I'm a friend of staying away from this market timing where you say, well, I have a cash bucket, so I don't have to withdraw when stocks are down. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And it's a hit or miss, right? I can show you examples where this would have worked really well, and I can show you examples where this would have been counterproductive.
Right. So the point that you made there was really well taken, was the fact that in your absolute worst case scenario, you deplete your bucket, it's time to refill your bucket, and you're still at the bottom. And now you're having to pull all of your money out of the market at these depressed prices. I guess the counterpoint would be, what does regular market withdrawals look like? And then what does asset allocation look like to reflect that? Because you can't tolerate the same level of volatility that you could when you were in the asset accumulation phase.
Right. So, I mean, I think a good start would be that, for example, you have your taxable account, and that taxable account pays you dividends and potentially interest, even though I would that goes back into the asset location and allocation question. So I would try to stay away from holding bonds in the taxable account, but that's a different question. So certainly the income that taxable account throws off, I mean, you might as well consume that, because for example, that income is likely going to be less than what your cash flow needs anyways, right? So because I think in their taxable account, they have around a little over $700,000. So you you take a 2% dividend yield on that. We're talking about maybe $14,000 a year. That's not enough to pay for the $80,000 or $90,000 in their budget. So the income that's thrown off, right, that is something that is taxable anyways. You might as well consume that. So just practically, there's no need to do dividend reinvestment. So that's one thing you would do that I would change when you retire. You would switch off the dividend reinvestments in your taxable account. So dividend payments and the interest payments that I get, they go into my checking account, and that's used for consumption. And then you have to decide, obviously, how do you cover the rest, right? So you might have around $14,000 a year in dividend income, but my total cash flow needs are somewhere between $80,000 and $90,000. So basically, the rest has to be taken out of the principal. So I would recommend that you start withdrawing from the highest cost tax slots. So you start withdrawing money from the assets that have a high cost basis, so that would lower your taxable income. So it would lower your.
I want to pause there just for a second. That's fantastic. But I think some people are probably saying, well, what does that even mean? And I know that when you log into a platform like Fidelity or Vanguard, there's multiple ways to draw out your money. You can do it just average cost. You can do it first in, first out. And the other one is you can specify ID for specific lots of money.
Right.
And you're telling it, hey, when I bought a couple years ago 20 or 30 or 100 shares at this price, that is on this date, that is all has an ID as one lot number. Is that correct?
Right. And so I urge everybody, and in fact, you probably have to do that when you set up your account. So you want to have this lot identification set up. And then when you withdraw, you can again specify how do you want to withdraw that. I mean, obviously, you want to withdraw only long-term capital gains, not short-term capital gains. That is probably not an issue because for most retirees, you've had these lots for 10, 15, 20 years once you retire and you withdraw the money. So very likely these are going to be long-term capital gains. But again, the most tax efficient way is to start withdrawing. And again, there might be some examples where it's not, but as a rule of thumb, I would start with the tax lots that would generate the lowest long-term capital gains.
And Karsten, just for clarity, that line of delineation between short-term and long-term is actually just 1 year. So for people out there thinking like, oh no, long-term, it's got to be 12 and a half years. It's just 1 year. So it's a point very well taken. But yeah, you don't want to sell short-term and be subject to short-term cap gains because that's at ordinary income tax rate. So you don't get the favorable taxation of the long-term.
And there's only one exception to the rule is if you have a tax lot that is short-term or either short-term or long-term and it's underwater, then you could sell that one and generate it's called tax loss harvesting. So you could generate a tax loss and that could be written off against your other capital gains, or even it could be compensating against your ordinary income. So which would be fantastic. So that's why a lot of people like that. But there's some limits to that. But this is not something that Becky and Steven probably have to worry about.
So with Becky and Steven, they're now doing this drawdown, and let's assume they're following your advice. I want to come back to mechanically what that looks like. I also wanted to ask you about the glide path. I know one piece of advice that you talk about frequently is, while maybe in the FI community we have this debate about paying off your mortgage or not, the answer there's a little more clarity when it actually when retirement is involved. And I'm curious your thoughts on how paying off your mortgage, that decision to pay off your mortgage, would affect the glide path.
So Becky and Steven have a home, a single-family home, and there's no mortgage on it. So I really like not having a mortgage in retirement. And even though when I was still working, I certainly enjoyed having a mortgage. Back in the old days, I could still write off the mortgage interest, and so there was some tax advantage to it, and there was some advantage due to leverage. So when you have very little in assets, you want to get started with your equity portfolio as quickly as possible. We talked about this in episode 35, if you remember. So you almost want to have leverage early on because your portfolio is so small. And in that case, a mortgage is not a bad way to get leverage. So don't pay off your mortgage if you're just starting out. So pay off your mortgage at the rate that your average 30-year mortgage specifies it, but don't accelerate your mortgage payoff. So you want to use the leverage and start accumulating assets as quickly as possible. But then in retirement, I think this whole equation flips. So I would argue that it's optimal in retirement to no longer have a mortgage. And the way I view a mortgage is that a mortgage is almost like a short bond, right? You have shorted a bond, and it's a bond at around maybe minimum 3.25%, probably all the way up to 4.5%. So especially for retirees that have a portfolio that is not 100% stocks, and I think 100% stock portfolio seems a little bit crazy risky to me, as most retirees are going to have a portfolio that's somewhere around, say, 60% stocks, 40% bonds. So why would you have a bond portfolio, a bond share in your portfolio with a 40% share, and at the same time have a mortgage, and the mortgage interest is higher than what you make in your bond portfolio? So I think that just if you look at, so Brad, you're an accountant, right? You have an asset and a liability, and the asset and the liability are both the same, and your liability has a higher interest rate than your asset. It's probably ideal to use that bond portfolio to pay off the mortgage, right? Unless you are a really crazy, almost risk-seeking, not risk-averse, but risk-seeking retiree with 100% stock portfolio. And then they say, well, that 100% stock portfolio is still not enough. I also want to have that short bond, which is the mortgage in my portfolio. So that's one of the reasons why I think it's ideal to have no mortgage in retirement. Now, there might be some exceptions. Say you still have 3 years or 5 years or 7 years of mortgage left over. And in order to pay it off all in one chunk, you would have some tax consequences, right? You would potentially have to liquidate a stock portfolio and pay a lot of money in capital gains taxes in order to get rid of the mortgage. There would be some constraints where I see that, okay, keep the mortgage around, just or the mortgage payment is not really very large relative to your retirement budget. But again, I would prefer not to have a mortgage. So one is that asset allocation aspect, and the other aspect is also the sequence of return risk, right? As we said, there's some time window, and it can be anywhere as short as 5 years. It can be as long as 15 years. Your first 5 to 10, maybe 15 years of your retirement is when you worry most about sequence of return risk. Why do you want to have this albatross around your neck, which is that big mortgage payment every month, exactly during the time when sequence of return risk matters so much? So every different aspect I look at, I would prefer not to have a mortgage in retirement. And so, for example, we bought a house last year and we just paid for it in cash. We don't have a mortgage. I might think about maybe getting a home equity line of credit set up that we don't really use, or we would use as an absolute last minute emergency, just as a cash flow, just to smooth out cash flows. But I certainly wouldn't want to have a 30-year mortgage on my house. I don't even want to have a 30-year mortgage with 10 more years left to pay on this house. I just want to be mortgage free. It makes for a much more relaxed and comfortable retirement, I can tell you that.
Yeah. So if we were to take this now, I'm kind of moving away from Becky just a little bit, but taking this person that enjoyed Becky's episode because they find themselves in a more similar stage of life. And maybe their target is they have a $1 million portfolio. They've been easing their way into, after they recognize after paying off their mortgage, they're going to have a 60-40 split stocks to bonds. And they're kind of now getting ready for this first year. The market goes down by, 30%. And they're automating their numbers, right? And I'm just thinking through what you made this point earlier about the bonds not being taxable. Where are the bonds held, and what does the strategy look like for them when they get to the end of that first year? So they've been drawing down from taxable, and then now they're coming to the end of that first year. Market's gone down 30%. They're preparing for year 2.
Right. So the two aspects that we have to cover here. So one is portfolio rebalancing. and one is the asset location. So first of all, so imagine you start with a 60-40 portfolio and stocks take a real bad beating. And bonds stay either flat or, as has been in the last few recessions, it's actually when stocks go down, bonds go up because interest rates are lower. So that's good for existing bondholders. So if you do your withdrawals, and it's not even particularly a glide path, but even if you want to keep a 60-40 portfolio and you want to rebalance back to that 60-40 portfolio, you would already avoid potentially taking money out of stocks, because you would take it out of the asset that has now appreciated relative, not just in absolute terms, but also in relative terms. So if we are in this drawdown periods for the stock market, you would already naturally take money out of your bond portfolio to cover your expenses. So even with the constant portfolio allocation of 60-40, you have something that looks like almost a glide path, because so stocks are down, so you take money out of your bond portfolio. So it's actually not a glide path, because you still rebalance back to your 60-40 at the end of the first year. So you would very likely take the majority of your cash flow needs out of bonds. You might even withdraw more than your cash flow needs from bonds and put the remainder into stocks. If stocks are really beaten down after 1 year, it's even conceivable that you would rebalance from bonds into stocks. So just by rebalancing your portfolio, you already have some. It's almost a valuation approach, right? You rebalance from the appreciated assets into the beaten up assets, hoping for the underperforming assets to turn around again, which actually has happened in a lot of recessions, right? You had the 2008-9 recession, you had a very sharp decline and then a very sharp recovery again. So with this rebalancing approach, yeah, I mean, it sounds a little bit like market timing, but even by doing something as passive as a 60-40 portfolio, there is an element of a valuation-based tactical asset allocation almost approach. Well, it's not really tactical asset allocation, because the weights, if they stay at 60-40, it has the same flavor of it, right? So you sell the expensive assets and you buy the cheap ones, hoping for a reversion back to the mean again.
All right, so Big Earn, people are watching this on YouTube and they say good Big Earn, the kind Big Earn on one side, and then we need to get like a Big Earn that has a frown on the other side. But I think the question everybody is wondering, what's the verdict with Becky? Can she retire yet?
So the verdict is, yes, they can indeed retire. I would almost argue that their $80,000 initial budget is a bit too conservative. So I would potentially take it up to maybe $85,000. $90,000 now you get, now you're pushing it a little bit, but certainly at $80,000 annual budget, $85,000, they will not just make it, but they will very likely have a ton of money left over even after 30, 35 years. So even during the worst possible recessions that we have seen and bear markets that we have seen in the past, their withdrawal pattern would have survived over 35 years. And that's assuming that you actually survive all the way up to age 98 or 100. So if you die before that, there's still a ton of money left over that you can leave to your kids and grandkids. So yeah, absolutely. It's the friendly ERN prevailed. I haven't even put up the nasty ERN yet.
We're going to get it commissioned, no doubt about it. Big ERN, thanks for joining us on the show today. This has been a blast.
Thank you so much.
All right, to our audience, you're listening to this. You wanted more details. You want to actually see the numbers that Big Earn was leaning on. He actually wrote up a case study, which is posted on earlyretirementnow.com. That is a website that you should go to just because. But if you want to see the specific study that he set up, one, we'll have it linked in the show notes. And two, we've set up a short code for you. You can just go to chooseify.com/Becky. I know Brad's going to correct me. That's Becky, Becky.
Chooseify.
You are welcome. All right, so let's go ahead and bring MK into this conversation. MK, I know that you had to mobilize quickly in order to get that episode to Big Earn and be able to give him enough time to analyze it and bring it back for audience. And I just want to say on behalf of the community, all the people that episode was shared with and really wanted to know, first of all, said thank you. And then two, practically, I know I need more drawdown information. On behalf of them, I want to say thank you for setting this up.
You're welcome. I mean, really, it was all Big Earn. He's the expert, and Becky was so great at sharing her information so quickly. She was like, here you go, I'll type it all up. So it was great that she's been so willing to share her journey. And it really is not exactly the same, but it's similar to what so many people have been asking for in our community and saying, is it too late for me? And our answer was no, it's not too late. But then understanding, okay, well, then what are the exact steps that I need to do? So having Big Earn come back in and share his expertise in our survey that we did over the summer, people said, I want more Big Earn. That was very specific. What can we do to improve? More Earn. And we're like, okay, we will get you some Big Earn. Thankfully, he was coming back on. And I really know that this content is going to help so many people as they're planning those very specific steps of, I have the big concepts. What do I do? What are the little tiny steps? So you're welcome to everybody. And if you have more questions, continue to send them in, and we will continue to be putting out more content like this. So if you are looking for more information from us, be sure to subscribe, not just to the podcast, but to our newsletter. So if you're somebody who is thinking, okay, like I listen to the podcast, but I'm in the car, I can't take notes, or I want to read more on it as well, if you process information that way, you can, of course, subscribe to our newsletter. Now, one great thing is that when you subscribe right now, you can get a free ebook that breaks down these big concepts. So go to choosefi.com/FI-guide. choosefi.com/FI-guide, and that will subscribe you to our email. So you will get all this information as we're putting it out. And it will also get you this free ebook where you can see financial independence made simple.
Yeah, it is a beautiful infographic series talking about the big tenets of financial independence, and really excited how it came together, and hope that you will access it personally and share with a friend. All right, now we actually have a huge announcement, and we recorded a segment that we are going to go ahead and play for you right now. All right, everyone. So if you've been listening to the show, you know that we put out a call to action for the community to have you tell us, if you're stuck, why that is. And as we looked for patterns to see how we could better serve the community, one of the things that came through was, I feel like there's no one speaking to me where I am. I feel like one of the things I'm dealing with is, well, all these things are great. I don't have time for these long, extended hour-plus long podcasts. I barely have 5 minutes that I can scratch together. I would love some content that has me in mind. And as we looked at our community, we realized that's more than a single individual. That represents a huge spectrum of our audience. And as we were looking to see, well, what would it look like to better serve this portion of our community, we started to engage in talks with Jillian Johnsrud, who writes over at MontanaMoneyAdventures.com. And if you remember, we've actually had her on the show at least 2 times, and her story is just absolutely unbelievable. And I think she brings to the conversation a level of empathy and understanding and compassion that, frankly, of all the people we've interviewed, is unparalleled. When I think about some of the content that she's produced, and also some of the conversations we've had behind the scenes, it gets me very excited for what the future brings. And Brad, I know both of us, we started to have this idea simmer. What if we could do a podcast with her? What if we could help produce something and bring something out that takes these incredible characteristics that she possesses, and at the same time take that energy and apply it back to these people the people that really are looking for this type of content?
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And yeah, I mean, Jillian is just one of those people who you feel instantly comfortable with. Empathy. It just exudes out of her. She's someone you want to spend time with. She's someone you want to get to know. And I mean, we have said privately, Jillian is just a superstar. There's just something special about her. And yeah, we started talking about what would it look like to have another podcast. And Jillian's name was at the very top of that list. And we've got something real exciting brewing today.
So Jillian in the studio today, actually our first our second in-person guest. I think Ed grabbed that mantle first, but you are just a half step behind him, our second in-person guest. Welcome to the Choosify podcast again, and so excited that you're joining us for this adventure.
I am so excited to be hanging out in Richmond. This is awesome.
From the Midwest to the East Coast.
Oh, it's so much warmer here.
Yes.
Yeah, you said it was 0 degrees in Montana the other day?
0 degrees.
Well, you had this wonderful retreat that I believe you had decent weather for, actually pretty good weather for, but the next day after everybody left, a little temperature drop.
A little cold.
Definitively, we are partnering on a podcast, which is going to be launched at the end of this year, beginning of 2020. And the title is going to be Everyday Courage. I tell you, I've had the chance to let that title just simmer, and it just warms my soul. But for our audience, why does this podcast exist?
I think as women, we've gotten to this point where there's a lot of pressure to do all the things and to have all the things. But the problem is all of the things have gotten a lot bigger. My mom used to crush it on a birthday party with like a sheet cake in the 80s. That was winning. If you just invite your friends over and you just let everyone know we're going to hang out for an afternoon, you're crushing it. Like, you're an awesome mom. And now it's like Pinterest unicorn rainbow sprinkle cakes. And there's so much pressure to be all the things to all the people that the reality is we're not leaning in to the things that actually really matter to us in our finances, in our careers, in our life. We're spread so thin that we're just tired and discouraged and sometimes overwhelmed. So the idea behind everyday courage is that we can just have a little bit more courage every day to set boundaries, to say no, to have hard conversations, to prioritize what matters to us, to get clarity on that, and then to go out into the world and not be everything, but to kind of be too much for the things that really are us, that are true to us, that are true to our goals and our values and our purpose for being here in the world. And so that's what I'm hoping this, in a very small container, in a very short little episodes, because we don't have a ton of time.
I was actually going to ask you about that. And one of the things when we were talking behind the scenes is you said, so many podcasts, and I guess we're guilty to some varying degree, so many podcasts are so long. Like as a mom with so many different responsibilities, I don't have time for a 2-hour episode. I simply don't. And in fact, if I give someone 15 minutes and they haven't gotten to the point yet, I'm viscerally angry at them. So just explain that to our audience, why that is kind of defining your goals for the cadence of the show.
Yeah, especially for me with 5 little kids, I'm interrupted all the time. Like, I just don't have long, luxurious, quiet, free blocks of time in my day. I've probably got like 10 minutes. And I love to be able to finish things. I love to check things off. I love to cross things off the list. I love to feel like I'm keeping up on things. And so when I see like, oh, I'm 20-hour-long episodes behind, I just feel overwhelmed and kind of like, oh, there's one more thing I'm failing at in life. But if I like show up at school pickup and I'm 10 minutes early and I'm like, sweet, I could like finish an episode and just have that little bite-sized chunk of encouragement and positivity and inspiration. And maybe it's something heartwarming that like powers me through my day. And I finish it without like small humans interrupting me. Yeah, I know that I would super appreciate it.
Yeah, Jillian, I totally agree. There's something about the stress of having all those podcasts back up on you. And, you know, for me, I listen in 1.5x. You could actually get a 15-minute episode done in 10 actual Earth minutes, which is kind of cool.
Brad, typical, stepping in with a solution.
Yeah. So you have a little more leeway there. But I love this concept because we look at financial independence as this umbrella for living a better life. I love when you're talking there about, you know, just getting a little bit better in just different aspects and what it means to you personally. And I think that people are looking for inspiration. They really are. And they're looking for just little tips to live genuinely a better life. So, yeah, I mean, I personally am incredibly excited to see what you put together here.
Oh, MK, talk about big announcement. That one is pretty exciting.
I am over the moon excited. When y'all first mentioned to me that this was an idea, I was just so giddy. That little kid like, I was so excited. So,
Brad and I do that patented move a couple times each month.
Yeah, for anybody watching on YouTube, you can see the excited dance. But if you're just listening, you're missing out. But I am so excited for the content that Jillian is going to bring. She always brings her A game or her A+ game. And she is just one of my favorite people in this community, present company excluded. You guys are great. But Jillian is
still
so
have
amazing.
A pulse.
Yes. But Jillian, she just brings it. She really puts out the best content and she is so genuine and wants to support people. And I think that's where I want to support her. And I hope other people will feel the same way, that because of who she is and her genuine nature, that they will fall in love with her as much as we all have.
Yeah, this is incredibly exciting. I mean, the Choose F5 family is getting larger here. That's amazing. This is the second Choose F5 podcast, and we just could not be more excited to have Jillian a part of the team here. So certainly we're going to give you, the audience, much more information over the next 6 to 8 weeks on exactly when this is going to launch. But stay tuned. Everyday Courage with Jillian.
Do you realize that, like, I don't know if we mentioned this, but 2020 is a new decade, like a new decade.
That is wild. And, it's funny when you think about like the 1900s, you think the 20s, the 30s, the 50s. I mean, we're coming up on that in the 2000s. This is the 20s of the 2000s. It's kind of trippy when you actually think about it like that.
Living in the future, my friends.
Yeah,
Living
really.
in the future. All right, MK, bringing in voices and feedback from the community. What do you got for us?
Well, today we have ZB who wanted to shout it from the rooftops. ZB said that today we paid off our mortgage, paid $116,000 in 22 months, while also maxing out their 401k. The feeling is unbelievable. We are truly debt-free. Looking forward to next year and all the goals we will smash. We are 34 and 32. Next year, we will contribute to max out the 401k while also maxing out IRAs, HSA, and adding any additional money to our brokerage account. So ZB, we are here to shout it with you. Congratulations.
That is awesome. All right. Well, before we close, just want to spend just a minute and get an update on our local groups.
Well, we have a new local group to welcome, Vancouver, Washington. Welcome to the Choosify family. We're excited to have you here. And we have some events coming up. So Choosify Nebraska is getting together on the 12th of November to do unconventional life hacks. So it'll be exciting to see what comes out of that meetup, all the different life hacks that people can do. Our Choosify Frankfurt group is having a meetup in Germany on November 13th. So for everybody listening internationally who's in the area of Frankfurt, Germany, can't wait to see you there. And on November 17th, Choosify Stanford is having a Friendsgiving potluck, continuing with our trend of potlucks and everybody getting together for delicious food.
That is awesome. And if you're listening to this and you want to get involved in your local group, to do that, you can just go to choosify.com/local. With well over 300 local groups all around the world, you will find a local group in your area. Find a community and get engaged today. Unfortunately, that is going to bring this episode to a close. But as you know, we like to finish every episode by doing a drawing for a copy of a book that we have found useful. And we're doing our book right now, Choosify Your Blueprint to Financial Independence. But I thought also we might throw a little curveball out here. I am seeing a new book on the backsplash of this screen in front of me. MK, I believe you just released a new book. And I'm thinking if you want to, if someone in the audience, they've read all the personal finance books, but they want to get a FI fiction book, if they want to get a fiction book by a FI author, then maybe we could throw in The Infinite. And MK, why don't you just take a second and tell us about your new book release?
Yes. Well, The Infinite is sci-fi, as in science fiction.
I see what you did there.
So it is a sci-fi adventure. So Nina wakes up in a parallel universe, and at first things seem better house, better job. But then she realizes that she is going to be stuck in this parallel universe, potentially with the person who kidnapped her there, if she doesn't find a way home in 24 hours. And she is not a physicist. So she has to enlist some help of friends to be able to help her travel across the multiverse. And she encounters different realities where different histories happen. So if you have liked The Man on the High Castle or Timeless or Michael Crichton, Jurassic Park, adventure stories like that, then you will love The Infinite. It's a fun adventure and mystery waiting for anybody who wants to travel the multiverse.
That is really cool. Okay, where would people find the book if they wanted to purchase it?
Anywhere great books are sold. So Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Nook, Apple, all the places.
So obviously they can search for Infinite, but can they search your name? Is it MK Williams, Mary Kate Williams? What are we looking at?
It's MK Williams. So MK Williams, The Infinite. And from there, you can also navigate to my FI fiction book, which Jonathan alluded to, Enemies of Peace. If you are truly just wanting to stay with FI reading, I appreciate that. So.
All right. Well, if you want to enter the drawing to win a copy as well, you can go to choosify.com/iTunes, follow the instructions, and leave us a short written review. Then send us an email to feedback@choosify.com, letting us know that you left a review and what screen name you left it under. We give away one book for every 5 written reviews that we get, and we announce the winner on the Friday Roundup. And MK, how many winners do we have today?
Today, we have one winner, and that is Joe. So Joe took to heart our idea of efficiency of words and time, and he says, a great resource, always an interesting listen with a variety of guests covering useful topics. Thanks, Joe.
Awesome. All right, my friends, the fire is spreading. We'll see you next time as we continue to go down the road less traveled.
You've been listening to Choose FI Radio Podcast, where we help middle-class America build wealth, one life hack at a time.